you could plate up a petri dish of organisms, and a very neat theory comes into contact with life, and within 24 hours your confidence and theory is in tatters. So for me there was something very interesting about the sort of scientific paradigm between the objective scientist and how that comes in terms of reality. And forward that a few years in terms of my organisational life in organisational change, I became very interested in how change actually happens from the perspective of the policy maker or the strategist, and how that comes to affect people in everyday life. And it was when I did my MBA that I started had developed the ability to articulate that in a confident way, in a way that also I found other people who were interested in those sorts of questions. So I came out of the MBA having found people that were interested in similar questions, articulating it perhaps in a slightly different way. And for me, the connection with my sort of tradition of microbiology became quite a key area that I could then use to explore from my own particular perspective. And it was a couple of years after finishing my MBA and starting to think about a doctorate, I got an opportunity of working with the Department of Health in the UK on the tricky question of organ donation and organ transplantation, and what would it be for a policy? How could one go about developing policy in a way that would deliver the intended results of increasing organ donation 50% over 5 years? So I used that as an opportunity for my doctoral studies, so both in terms of policy making, strategy, implementation, and affecting the front line. And that's something that I discuss at some length in the book. So that connection with sort of my sort of interest in the hinterland between sort of science and more organic processes. So roll that forward, finished my doctorate, and the one thing I would say about a doctorate is it does change. It changed me. It changed the kind of areas that I was interested in. Not quite sort of interested in the organisational life I'd been part of, and decided to sort of go into academia and also organisational development, organisational design and consultancy, and then finally choosing the sort of more academic route in terms of becoming a full-time lecturer. And then the other two things that were quite interesting was, one is that growing confidence in terms of articulating voice, in terms of the written voice, articles, books, that type of thing. But also, I'll come on to a bit later, about how one enters a new community, having completed a doctorate, and having the confidence to sort of shape, form, and do something new with those sorts of communities. And I found it very sort of carrying out the doctorate. Douglas.
So I hope one of the contrasts that will help you all is that I didn't do an MBA, I didn't come to a doctorate that way, and I have not made a career change into academia, and wouldn't want to. My original degrees were in maths and statistics, and I then had 10 years working in a mainly financial sort of environment in the UK Ministry of Finance, and then I became a headhunter. And I did the doctorate at a point where I had already decided to leave headhunting after 18 years there and explore, I wasn't sure, what I would do afterwards. I mean, what I've gone on to do afterwards is advise people in mid and senior career on career change. And you can see some of that stuff on maslowdatic.com. And I was drawn, however, to really try. I was bugged by these 18 years that I'd spent as a headhunter helping select people for senior roles in the private and the public sectors. And to be honest, it's often done really badly. And there were problems that I kind of sensed with what went on that I couldn't articulate at all. So in a way, this was a kind of after 18 years of doing, wondering really what the hell it was I had been doing. And also, when you work as a headhunter, it's a pretty frantic existence. So you don't really pause and reflect that much along the way. What I'll say else at this point is the decision in my case to start a career change before I'd done the doctorate had some pros and cons, as I see it now, in terms of the research that I was able to do and what I was able to produce from that research. So an advantage is that when I finished my doctorate and came to write a book called Choosing Leaders, an applied research book, which makes the case for a paradigm shift in how we think about selecting people for senior roles, there was a gain in that people did not see me as belonging to a headhunting firm. They did not see me as simply producing a piece of marketing material to draw attention to a particular headhunting firm. And indeed, several different headhunting firms were happy to host events at which I could speak. So I think that was an advantage. But there was also a disadvantage in that obviously I was actually becoming more detached. Go on now to look particularly at how do you choose what kind of program, doctoral similar program, because it's an extremely confusing marketplace out there. So if you're feeling confused, I think the first thing is just it's reality, not you, that really ought to be adjusted. This is not a well-developed marketplace. This is not like a supermarket with different tins where you just have to read the label. You have got confusion about two main things: confusion about title, PhD, DBA, and so on and so forth, and you have got this confusing range of length of time that it can take to do a doctorate. So if you look around hard enough, you'll find there's certain kinds of quite specific doctorate that you can do if you've done certain prior qualifications in a year. You'll also find doctorates that take 7 years or potentially 7 years part-time. I guess part-time doctorates, the average would be around 3 or 4 years. But you're probably also well aware, and you may have friends in academia who say indignantly that their PhD took them 3 or 4 years full-time. So that makes up a very confusing picture. In order to make sense of that confusing picture, I think it's worth focusing on two fundamental questions. One is, as far as you are aware, are you planning to try and make a career change into academia? And secondly, how do you and the program that you are thinking of joining perceive the relevance of your work experience to what it is you're going to research? I'll just say those two questions again. I think the two fundamental questions to sort through are, do you think you're trying to make a shift into academia? And is there agreement in your mind and with the program you want to join on the relevance of your work experience to what you're doing? Let me just go to each of those. So the reason why academics do full-time PhDs that take them 3 or 4 years, I mean, in truth, they're not completely full-time because they're workhorses that universities use to teach, but universities gloss over that bit. But essentially, let's be generous and call them full-time. These programs are designed not simply to produce a doctoral quality thesis. They're designed to produce two other things. They're designed to give those who take them an in-depth foundation in research method that will be sufficient to support a lifetime career in research. So if you look at it from that point of view, you really do need to know an awful lot about an awful lot of research methods to do a doctorate for that reason. And so those doctoral programs will very often begin with a year or even two full-time of essentially just studying methods. That's not necessarily the most appealing or helpful thing if you are doing a doctorate because you actually want to understand, as I was, how we could choose leaders better. The second question was about the relationship between your experience and what the program and what study and research you would be doing are. One situation is where you've decided to research something that's completely unconnected to your work experience. I guess Rob and I probably don't have a lot to say about that because it could be a PhD in art history or something like that. We don't have much insight to offer into that kind of choice. But there's a big divide between programs where you say, okay, well, actually, I want to study this because it's relevant to my work in banking or consulting or organizational change. You might be saying, I think I've got insights gained from my experience, in which case you need to check whether your doctoral program is going to value that or is going to tell you that actually they want you to throw that away, put it out of your mind, and become a detached scientist. In another situation, it may be that there are advanced methods or data sets that you have access to at work that could lead to an original contribution to knowledge. There, perhaps what you would need to check is on confidentiality, because most doctoral theses need to be published. So just to summarize, as you're trying to make sense of this supermarket, we can't say choose a PhD rather than a DBA or anything simple like that, because the market is just too chaotic. The labels aren't consistently meaningful. You have to ask questions of each program. My vote would be, are you curious, or do you want someone to write a certificate saying you already know a lot about your subject? If it's the latter, I question whether you should do a doctorate at all. A doctorate is to be done by someone who is curious about something. I've explained why preparing for a career in academia or not is a relevant thing and would explain some of the differences in the programs. Do you want to make an original contribution to knowledge, or do you simply want to take existing knowledge and apply it to your workplace? The latter, arguably, is not a full doctorate. Do you want to be very alone? A lot of especially traditional doctoral programs, you study alone and you will see your supervisor perhaps 3 or 4 times a year. That is a very, very, very hard way to do a doctorate. If it suits you and what you want to do and your workload, that's fine, but be aware that you can look around and find other programs where there will be learning sets or at least much more cohort and peer support. Have you got a good research question? If you have, it's worth asking yourself why you think it's a good research question, because a question that is interesting in the world of practice doesn't automatically mean it's an interesting question to researchers, to professors, full-time academics. If you don't think you've got a research question, you just, as I had, have a kind of gnawing curiosity, don't be put off. Look for a doctoral program that enables you to work with that curiosity rather than one that demands that you write a polished 2,000 words at the beginning, showing what a little academic you've already managed to become in framing your initial research question. And lastly, while everyone starts a doctorate, hoping and determined to complete it, things can happen which mean you won't complete it, because it's a significant number of years. So you want to be clear in your own mind, if you have to exit partway through, would you rather have a master's or partial qualification where you've spent that time studying your problem and your field of interest, or would you rather emerge with what's called typically an MRes these days, a Master's in Research, which is really a taught degree in research method? Over to Rob now.
So what I'm going to discuss here is the sort of transition between working at master's standard and working at doctoral level. So when I look back on my MBA, there were a number of things that I felt. First of all, an array of new ideas and different ways of looking at the world, and a sense of enthusiasm and keenness about those ideas. A feeling of having gone through a rigorous intellectual challenge of doing an MBA, but also there's still something a little bit left, some unanswered questions, or rather an irritation in my part of the some superficial, what I felt was superficial ways some of the material being presented to me.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello, so I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just having a little trouble hearing you. We were fine hearing you earlier, but when you switched presenters, it's slightly less clear.
Oh, okay. So
This is perfect.
hopefully you can hear me more clearly now.
Yes,
Apologies
this is perfect.
for apologies for that, and thank you for the tip. So I was just discussing the transition between carrying out a master's level qualification and that of a doctorate. So there are a number of things that I came away from my MBA with. New ideas, a sense of intellectual challenge, a frustration, an increasing perhaps confusion around some of the areas that I was really becoming really very interested in. I was also developing a voice in a new community, and people who I was interested in and respected. There was a sense of kudos. I'd done an MBA, people had recognised that I'd undertaken an MBA, and there was that recognition of that. Now, some of these features were really helpful when I undertook an MBA, undertook a doctorate, and others perhaps less so. The major criteria in terms of carrying out a doctorate is that there is really no set path. Although many of the programs you might see offer a framework, as Douglas has described, really, ultimately, it is your path, it is your question, and it is you that will have to defend your ideas and your contribution to knowledge in a viva. So ultimately, it is your path, and as you increasingly undertake your doctorate, you will be a master of that path as you go along. Now, Douglas already mentioned the loneliness side. I will counter that slightly to say that Douglas is right. It can be a very lonely process, but it's also a personal responsibility in the sense of finding that community that you want to be part of. So when you complete your research, and as you're undertaking that research, to develop a clarity as to who really is interested in your research, what communities are those, and then increasingly becoming a part of that. So that might mean going to conferences. I looked at people who are writing in the field that I became interested in and contacted them, met up with them. So there is a personal responsibility to find and form those different friendships and groups that so instead of relying on the program to do that for you, there's a responsibility for one to do that for oneself. And in that there's a great, I personally found a huge sense of achievement, and it was an enormously worthwhile thing to do. And then as one undertakes a doctoral program, there's something about developing a confidence about voice and about contribution and being part of a wider group, and then developing from that, there is a sense of responding to the feedback, not only of your supervisor, increasingly of all those other people that you're becoming interested in, and those networks that you've formed. The other thing that is important to stress is the ability to form and defend a sustained argument. So although right at the beginning you may have a research question, or rather in my case and Douglas's case this sort of perhaps a niggle, first of all to accept the fact that that research question will evolve and develop and shape, and it's important to recognise that forming of that research question and perhaps that shift in that research question, but also to be able to develop a sustained argument. That sustained argument may be in the form of, will be in the form of a paper of 60,000 words or so, and of a conversation that you're going to have with two examiners who are going to be sort of testing your ideas and how confident you are in them. So it's a case of doing your research, being clear about the methods that you're using. So how can you sort of validate and defend yourself in terms of the way you've gone about your research? Being clear as to who is saying what in your field, who is saying what, but also where do you see the gap? Where do you see a contribution to be made, and being able to defend that? And then after you've done your research, you've gone out there speaking to people, done your questionnaires, or your quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, how you then bring that all together in a clearly defined argument over an extended word length. The important thing to stress is that you do have a supervisor, you do have people that you can look to give you support and guidance, and the thing that I would recommend there is to be quite assertive and quite engaged with the supervisor, and that might require further work to be done. Okay, so that's a little bit about what distinguishes masters from doctoral standard. I'll just return back very quickly to say that a couple of things that is perhaps less helpful is this issue of kudos. If you're looking to do a doctorate just for the letters in front of your name, I would ask the question: will that be sufficient to sustain you through that period of intense intellectual endeavour? The next part I'd like to sort of talk to is how one becomes a member of this sort of community, to become a member literally of the academy. So in undertaking a doctorate, one is not seeking to gain a qualification. It is literally to become a member of the academy, and that will culminate in a 2-hour discussion with your examiners, who will test and probe your ideas and how you articulate your defence against that. I carried out a viva for a candidate yesterday, and it's a challenging experience, and also it's a very, very worthwhile experience. Speaking for myself, and I think for Douglas as well, I look back on my viva as a very, very enriching experience, where I could talk about my research passionately for a couple of hours with two people who had to read and to understand what I was saying, and that engagement, that conversation was an extremely good one. But just coming back to becoming a member of the academy, like becoming a member of any community, becoming a member of any sort of group, there are rules and ways of working. Many of those rules that you can read about in the books, or in material that you get from a university before enrolling onto a program. So some of those rules are quite explicit. Some of those rules are actually quite tacit. They're quite nuanced, and really you only become aware of them when you sort of walk into those glass doors and become quite sort of discombobulated, as it were, by sort of strange things that, you know, people who are expert in the community, those communities, become sort of are second nature to. And what I would just suggest there is that that's just a part of becoming a member of that of a new group. And I remember in my Viva, I'd included quite a few writers and thinkers. One of them was the postmodernist Jacques Derrida. Another one was Wittgenstein. And the question was, well, okay, if you get those two into the same room, if you could have done that, what would you have done to stop a fight breaking out? And the sort of little sort of area of that I transgressed was the issue of different areas of thought and how those can either spark off each other or can lead to some form of conflict. The other thing I would say is that when you do undertake a doctorate and you do undertake a doctorate and you are defending it, the most important thing is to realise that it doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be a rigorous exploration of your question. But you're never going to finally finish that question. You're going to move that question on and come up with some answers. It needs to be good enough, and when you're examined for your thesis, it needs to be good enough for that contribution of knowledge. Okay, handing back to Douglas now.
So if one makes it through this, we want to now look at what might the benefits be. And I'm going to look at the benefits potentially to an employer and to society more widely. And then Rob will pick up the question of some of the more personal benefits to you yourself from having done something that in magnitude, I would say, sort of, you're talking about a commitment of a magnitude a bit like deciding to have another child. In terms of business benefits, I said generalizations are difficult, so what I thought I would do first is just put some quite specific things up and hope that you can make some inferences or deductions from them. So I've just taken 3 different workplace scenarios. One is someone contemplating doing a doctorate, this is the middle column of the table, who's perhaps in a client-facing role in a consultancy or professional organization. Secondly, I've imagined someone in a senior management or middle management role, perhaps in a large global manufacturer. And then I've imagined someone where you are your own boss. So in a sense, it is you have to satisfy about the investment of time and effort, and you're running your own service business. So on the left, I've put in red things which I think are very suspect, which I would say are, if you do it hoping that there's some kind of magic bullet in those areas, you may well be disappointed. And in green on the right, I've put things which, from my experience, there is potentially something really worthwhile to gain, something really potentially powerful. So for the client-facing professional, perhaps in a large or medium-sized consultancy, if you think that doing a doctorate will boost your sales and help you get promoted to partner, I think that's relatively unlikely. I myself would not, if someone came to me and said they wanted me as employer to support them to do a doctorate for that reason, I'd refuse. However, if I think a very likely and powerful benefit is actually to make a contribution to becoming recognized as a thought leader in an area of your work, or just simply avoiding getting stale. I mean, at the point I did a doctorate, I'd been doing headhunting for 18 years. And I can certainly say that if I had decided to stay in headhunting, doing the doctorate I did would have been an incredibly powerful tonic. It would have just re-energized. I would have seen the world I was in a very different way. And of course, thought leadership and the energy that people sense when they realize, you're not stale. You've actually got quite radical and imaginative and interesting things to say. which they're not hearing from your competitors, yes, those things can and do lead to sales. But I think that's the pathway, and not the shortcut that you simply get more sales by having the letters in front of your name. If you're in a large manufacturer, and you might be thinking there not so much of clients as of getting promoted, getting closer to the C-suite or getting into the C-suite, I'd be very skeptical that getting a doctorate would help that, with the qualification that if you are in a country or industry in which many senior people have doctorates, then it may be a hygiene factor. It may be a necessary but not sufficient for you to get the promotion. And just at the bottom of the slide, we've put an observation that Britain, where we're speaking from, we think treats doctorates with mild suspicion. The business benefits are likely to be greater if you're in a national culture, and I think America and Germany are some examples, or you are in an industry, such as academia itself or economics, where senior people very often do have doctorates. Okay, if you are in a major manufacturer, though, if it's unlikely to just get you a promotion to the C-suite, and indeed in Britain it may make people a bit suspicious whether you're really as practical and dynamic and effective as they want. I think there are some clear benefits that it could do. One is if there's a discipline, whether it's robotics or big data or some aspect of customer service or knowledge management or supply chain, that is a really important area for success in your industry, and you really world class, not just using that as some sort of marketing phrase. Clearly, that kind of unidisciplinary, single discipline doctorate could be very, very useful there. Because it gives you the opportunity to link outside the competitive boundaries of your company with experts in all sorts of countries in the world who are studying, researching your area. But I think one of the biggest and most exciting benefits, one of the things, if I were your employer in a major manufacturer, I'd be keenest to pay to have you do a doctorate, would be if you see an opportunity to bring together two different disciplines that at the moment are kind of siloed. This is one of the areas where, both in academia and in the real world, everyone says, oh, the great benefits of bringing things together. But so very few people actually get to realize those benefits, because it's really, really hard. But if you see a good opportunity to do that, then doing a doctorate in which you frame the question or develop the question in that way could be really exciting and could create a lot of value for your employer as well as for you. If you're your own boss in a service business, I just raise the caution just to avoid an automatic assumption that if you just add a doctorate, you'll therefore be more successful. I think it's possible in some markets to become too expert. And my own former one, headhunting, is possibly a case in point. I think if I'm really candid, I think what in my market, or my former market, what client really wants was someone kind of reassuring and dynamic who's sufficiently knowledgeable that they feel comfortable trusting something very sensitive to this person, but who actually has got a degree of wide-eyed enthusiasm about the thing which the client is trying to achieve. In some disciplines, there is the possibility, as you understand more seriously and more critically, the problems, the mistaken assumptions, and all of those things, you might actually become more knowledgeable and slightly less wide-eyed and enthusiastic, and in brutal commercial terms, in some markets, that might not lead to more sales. But on the other hand, if you're in a market where having greater credibility, and I think particularly, for example, as I am now in a one-person business, having a doctorate in something relevant is, I would say, palpably helpful in people realizing that you're not just rubbish. And if you can actually then contribute to thought leadership, then there's a real benefit that can be gained. Just working through on a spectrum of then, as we've said, doctorates vary a lot. So if we just take a spectrum, starting with ones which are relatively less involved in groundbreaking research, more teaching, you're more taught stuff, through to doctorates that become progressively more challenging, I think we can identify these sorts of benefits to the wider market and society, and indeed to the academy. So just simply at the level of teaching, my observation is that there is considerable and justified demand in business schools for people who are practitioners who have done a doctoral level qualification and can teach from a combination of practical experience and rigorous thinking. So if you enjoy teaching, I think that's a really good reason to do a doctorate. Even if your doctorate isn't incredibly revolutionary, you will certainly have taken 2 or 3 major steps up in your ability to think critically about new fashions in practice. And speaking from my experience, you'll look back at what you thought of as, quotes, research findings, unquotes, that come from very distinguished consultancies, and probably treat them with considerably less deference than you did before the doctorate. Got a contribution potentially to make to business and society in taking the research findings of brilliant academics and making them useful in practice and influencing. I mean, I think there's a huge need to influence the future research agenda, to engage those people who've chosen, and many of our brightest minds have gone to be full-time academics, and some of them are formidably bright and have developed really interesting and powerful tools for thinking differently and more deeply about things. But in large part, they don't necessarily know what the best things to think about are. And practitioners who get a doctoral level qualification can play a really powerful role in bridging the gap of language, concepts and ways of thinking between people who are working in a marketplace and those full-time academics. But I wouldn't want to stop short of going to me, the final peak and saying it isn't just about bridging and teaching and filling in gaps that others have left. Actually, if you do a doctorate that takes your experience as a practitioner seriously, you can create the possibility of challenging what is taken as common sense in your industry or line of work, and challenging all kinds of hitherto unsuspected and unjustified forms of intellectual dominance. Really, and if you want to see what that looked like for me in practice, you could look at my book on choosing leaders, but there are many, many other examples. I really passionately believe in the truth of the quotation that I've put down there. If you are thinking, well, is a doctorate fundamentally really of use in practical situations? I think there's so much truth in this quotation. Practical men and women who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. You have the opportunity to identify and overthrow the defunct economist and maybe make some money and some reputation in the process.
On this slide, I just want to address the issue of personal benefits and personal qualities. I don't really want to overstress the issue of intellectual ability. That's important, but the 2 other aspects that are really important for doctorate is, first of all, that driving question. I think we've already addressed that. But secondly, that issue of stamina. And if you get those 3 connections right, those 3 dynamics, then you are on your way to having a sustainable, enjoyable, and very worthwhile experience in undertaking a doctorate. And the one thing I would say is that the issue of personal qualities and benefit is the issue that as one undertakes a doctorate, one's views and ideas change, and this becomes in itself, from my experience, a very self-sustaining process whereby one meets new people, becomes exposed to some new ideas, far deeper ideas in my case philosophy or sociology, psychology to some extent, which becomes again sustaining of that original idea. And then towards the end, you can see, well, I can see some of the benefits of the research, and that in itself is a very worthwhile thing in itself, but also experience. And then coming through the end, the process of the doctorate, being able to see some new opportunities which were quite different from my perspective, but a new way of seeing the world.
Douglas here, I'll just add one thing to what Rob has said. If I think of on our programme some of the individuals who did not complete and effectively left because they chose not to go on, or in effect the programme was in the process of choosing for them not to go on. While they were all different individuals, quite a common pattern was someone who was actually very, very bright and may even have read thousands of relevant books before even starting the programme, but actually lacked the humility and the flexibility to follow the twists and turns of a question changing, or discovering that the community that you're trying to join wants to think about your question in a different way. So I'm just echoing what Rob says, that it is not, a doctorate is not in any obvious way correlated to sort of your GMAT score.
Well said, Douglas.
So we're just going to take, before we see if we've got any questions, we'd love to have some questions, but I don't know if the technical difficulties may have hampered that. We're just going to each take 2 minutes to say something about the book that we've written that could go further if you're interested too.
One thing that you'll find in the book that's slightly different from other explorations of carrying out a doctorate is this. When you read about carrying out a doctorate normally, it feels quite straightforward in the sense of a number of processes to be undertaken. What we've tried to do here is taking our own experience seriously, is to sort of delve into the experiential, delve into what it was actually like, both the struggle, the confusion, the fun, and also the process of developing one's question, going on to the programme, and after the processes afterwards, and what that opened up. So that, for me, I think is the couple of things that I think are particularly important. Douglas?
I'd like to pick something different. While our book very much exposes you to the kind of emotional thrills and spills of what our two different journeys were like, it does so from a theoretically disciplined point of view, which means that in the course of the book we develop and argue a point of view, a theory of knowledge. If you're going to make a contribution to knowledge, which is the acid test of a doctorate, in that viva, you will by definition have to take a position on what you think knowledge is, and not just as a personal opinion, I happen to think knowledge is like this. You will have to discuss that and locate that in how the academic community in different ways has thought about knowledge. So we do that we carve our path in the book, and if you read the book, and just like in a doctoral thesis, not so much, the key point is not so much whether you come out fully agreeing with us, because you'll have your own perspective on what you think knowledge is. But if the process of reading and thinking quite perhaps in an unfamiliar way about what knowledge is something that you begin to find a bit exciting, although confusing, then that's a good sign that you might want to do a doctorate. If you find, as you go through it, that you simply can't understand, why would anyone want to theorize about what knowledge is? Because it's perfectly obvious, isn't it, what knowledge is? Then that would be a warning light in my mind about doing a doctorate. I think that finishes what we wanted to say, and we'd love to take some questions if there's time and if the technology has allowed.
Hello, thank you both very much for delivering that wonderful webinar. We've had really good feedback during the webinar about it. Someone's even demanded that you do another webinar purely for those who want to study for personal satisfaction, so it was obviously very popular. As I mentioned, or actually mentioned, we will start taking questions now. We do have one question from Jan Lee, and Jan Lee says, are there opportunities for the over 60s to study for a PhD?
Douglas here. Yes, there absolutely are. That's assuming you've got some money to pay the fees. And as someone who has worked for the last 6 years as a careers advisor, I'd wholeheartedly recommend taking it seriously. I hope your friends will encourage you, but if you find your friends and colleagues raise their eyebrows and say, why would you want to do that? What's the point? I'd say there could be lots of points. Not only the personal benefits that Rob talked about, but there is the sheer excitement of understanding more deeply what it is you did during your working life. But I think also then, if you come up with some insights which are quite challenging, particularly of some of the vested economic and commercial interests in society, you're in a position to be really brave and not timid after your doctorate. After all, Warren Buffett is still going strong and having a lot of impact on the world. Why shouldn't you?
I just want to answer the question from a slightly different perspective. I was contacted a couple of years ago by somebody in her mid-60s in America. I did mention about forming new communities, and we somehow got together, and she had this lifelong real interest and saw it as an opportunity when she got to 60 to pursue that. And I heard, she wrote to me 6 months ago to say that she was awarded her doctorate. So the answer to a very short question is yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both. At the moment, we have no other questions. So unless anyone had anything they would like to say to our two speakers, Robert or Douglas, I'd like to thank you both very much for delivering the webinar and putting up with the technical issues in the beginning. I'm glad it all went smoothly in the end. I'd also like to thank you for what was a very practical and full of useful information. And this is probably one of the few webinars where we've seen all the attendees who actually registered attend, so clearly it was something that was of great interest to our members. I'd also like to thank our members for logging in and also for putting up with us and being patient in terms of technical difficulties. You know how technology is sometimes, so we're glad that you enjoyed the webinar and glad that you were able to hear the useful and practical presentation. The slides and the audio will be available after the webinar, just in case you missed anything. And I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Warwick and Douglas Ford once again. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Okay, goodbye.